All here. I know you are as excited as I am about this event, this quite unusual event that we're having here in Washington, known for its policy-oriented symposia and so forth, and to have one focused on the arts and culture is really a breath of fresh air. Before we begin, of course, let me tell you who I am. My name is Edward Joseph, and I'm the executive director of the Institute of Current World Affairs, the organizers of this event. And I want to, first couple of acknowledgments. I want to first thank SAIS for allowing us to use this facility. And in particular, I would like to acknowledge Heidi Obermeyer. Heidi, where are you? She's here somewhere, of the Center for Transatlantic Relations. Heidi, thank you so much for arranging everything. I also want to acknowledge our Saira Rahman, who you see striding up here, who's shouldered the burden of organizing this event, and I know we're all excited to be here. So quickly, let me tell you a few words before I hand the baton off here to our next esteemed speaker. Let me quickly tell you a few words about the Institute of Current World Affairs. We've been around 92 years, this institute, and we got our origin, in fact, in the Middle East. The founder of ICWA, as we call it, was Charles Crane, close friend of Woodrow Wilson. Those of you who are Middle East experts may know of the King-Crane Commission, the commission that carried out the first public opinion surveys of Arab public opinion, meant to carry out Wilson's idealistic notions of self-determination, and many people will know the name Charles Crane. Charles Crane was at Versailles with President Wilson, and like Wilson, came back dismayed by the secret British and French diplomacy that gave us the borders of the Middle East that we still contend with 100 years later. In reaction, he founded the Institute of Current World Affairs. And our mission is to identify highly promising young Americans, that's 35 and under. SAIS grads are perfectly eligible to apply, and we've had a number. And we send these highly promising young Americans overseas to a country or region of their choice where they carry out their own exploration for 2 years. And frequently they come back, and it's our hope they will come back both deeply knowledgeable about that country or region, and possibly and often transformed by the experience. Now, one of those highly promising young Americans we selected is right here in the front row, Jonathan Guyer. And Jonathan has done absolutely outstanding work for ICWA in his 2 years as an ICWA Fellow based in Cairo. And Jonathan, we are very grateful to you not only for your great work, but for having assembled this terrific group of artists, writers, critics, and we really look forward to a exciting, stimulating discussion. So Jonathan, thank you very much. In addition, let me, if the other esteemed panelists and speakers will allow me, I would like to single out Ganzier, the artist Ganzier, who is with us today, and thank him so much for that striking poster that he did for this event. Ganzier, thank you very much for that. Beautiful, beautiful work. In addition, I want to tell you that our ICWA Fellows, after this experience, they frequently become impassioned and very loyal to the Institute. And one of those who has been remarkably loyal to the Institute is our chair, Dirk Vanderwall, who is, I believe, the preeminent Libya expert in the world, also a widely consulted expert on the Middle East. Dirk will later give us the keynote remarks for this event. And welcoming us and co-sponsoring this event is the esteemed Director of Middle East Studies at SAIS, Professor Camille Pekastang. And Camille, let me tell you folks, this is quite appropriate that it is Camille who welcomes us here to SAIS, and we're very grateful, Camille, to you for doing that. Camille is himself a social psychologist and a social historian who specializes and focuses on the issues of culture and identity, and as well as cultural and social evolution. So there could not be a closer fit with academia here at SAIS, and it is to Camille who I give the floor to. Camille, thank you so much.
Edward, thank you for your kind words. And well, on behalf of the Middle East Studies program at SAIS, I want to welcome everyone. As a Middle East Studies program based in Washington, we've seen a lot of interest for the region. And I can say that most of what people are interested in tends to be always the same, pretty much in the following order. Obviously, Al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State, jihadists and terrorists, revolutions, the scuffles between Israelis and Palestinians, nuclear weapons, civil wars, and somewhere like far down the line, elections in the region. More rarely, people look at economics, and when they do, it's mostly about oil production, oil prices, and unemployment, especially when unemployment in the region leads to immigration to other parts of the world. People also talk a lot about Islam and ask a lot about Islam, and they see Islam as something pervasive, monolithic, intangible, and generally frightening. Almost never people ask about culture, whether the arts or popular culture. In fact, culture seems to be completely subsumed into Islam. The region is just a place that is defined by that. And yet, beyond the entertainment value, popular culture and the arts are essential in non-free societies because they are one of the few vectors of political expression. For years, modern music, poetry, theater, films, cartoons, and satires have been the safest channel, not always safe, but relatively safer to critique the status quo. To give just an example, I mentioned Andala, probably famous to some of you. It's a 10-year-old Palestinian boy with no face and no shoes. I think he was started in the late 60s, shortly after the Six-Day Wars. And since then, it has been the face of the Palestinian refugees. The governments have responded to culture with censorship. Turkish novelists have been arrested. Iranian cineasts have been forced into silence or into exile. Moroccan musicians have been harassed and intimidated. Governments have also tried to appropriate the cultural field. And here I'll give examples of massive museums and operas that the Saudis and Emiratis are currently building in that purpose. And political Islam also has developed its own very powerful culture and combated alternative forms of culture, usually the hard way, by physically destroying it. Arts and culture are not neutral and static. They are dynamic and powerful, hard to control, hard to orient. Arts and popular culture are an essential field of political contestation and self-definition, and these are far more interest than they usually receive. The Middle East program here at SAIS is actually launching an online platform called Beaufort. It's after the Beaufort Castle in South Lebanon. There's reasons for that, but that's a long story. But it will be a modern, postmodern Orientalist forum. You can appreciate the paradox of that, but that's what it will be. A postmodern Orientalist forum where, among other things, we'll discuss Arabs through the prism of their popular culture. But for now, I just want to congratulate, where did Edward go? I've disappeared. I just want to congratulate our friends at ICWA for organizing such an interesting conference. And I will turn to the keynote speaker and esteemed colleague, Professor at Dartmouth University and the specialist of Libya, Dr. Van der Waal.
Thank you so much, Professor Pakistan. And welcome, first of all, to all of you. It's wonderful to see, first of all, so many Institute people here, but also a lot of young people from SAIS. And I hope you will have a wonderful time today listening to our two panels. I should say that I was asked to give the keynote here, and as somebody who has worked professionally in the Middle East for the last 25 years or so, it's first of all a real delight to be here to look at a topic that ordinarily I would never really investigate, although I have written extensively on the Middle East for the last 25 years or so. I certainly have never really given much sustained thought to the role of art in the region, nor to the politics behind its production, or to the kind of politics it in turn engenders. But as I was gathering my thoughts for these introductory remarks, I thought back to when I was a fellow in Libya in the mid-1980s and met a remarkable man, a young cartoonist at the time called Mohammed Zwawi. And Zwawi was what today, I guess, or if you think back to medieval times, we would call a court jester. You know, he could write, he could draw all the cartoons he wanted, as long as he didn't really criticize Gaddafi. And there were some absolutely wonderful cartoons that he did draw, really skewering the Libyans for all kinds of social ills that, of course, resonated with the agenda that Gaddafi himself had. And then, in the aftermath of the fall of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, a whole new set of cartoons emerged. And these were very satirical, very critical, of course. You saw Gaddafi as a skinny-legged chicken running around. Obviously, the kind of things that Zwawi wouldn't have been able to write about. And as I reflected on it, and then, you know, this was taken up, these cartoons were taken up, the ones that initially emerged in Libya were taken up, particularly by a number of very well cartoonists, Riyad Sattouf, for example, who then, that Jonathan has also written about in his book, The Future of the Arabs, drew a long kind of a 40-page cartoon about what life under Gaddafi was like. And as I was looking at these two, kind of juxtaposing these two events, so to speak, in my life, you know, the early cartoons of Zwawi, and then the cartoons that emerged in the wake of the fall of Gaddafi, the Arab Spring, I was kind of struck how, first of all, cartoons and art in general have, of course, been a very, very powerful tool that has been used by those in opposition to the state, but as I'll tell you all about also in a few minutes, by those that represent the states. And the fact also that cartoons potentially or actually by design or accidentally can and have been highly subversive in Middle East politics. But above all, what struck me was the kind of tightrope that cartoonists and artists must walk in light of the kind of dualities that they keep facing in the Middle East. And although these kinds of dualities and dilemmas that art now faces in the Middle East have existed for a long time and across different cultures, you know, think of the fact, you know, there were cartoons in the ruins of Pompeii. If you look at Mughal art, you know, the kind of introductions that were made into Mughal art that were against the emperor's wishes and so on, all of this goes back a very long way. But in many ways, as I think our panelists will tell us today, the kind of modalities of expressing dissent have changed very rapidly, particularly as more technology came online over the last few years, and particularly in light of the Arab Spring, of course, we've seen how a lot of what happened, you know, instantly became international news. And I want to say a little bit about this kind of duality that we see in the Middle East about art and the politics of art. As I said, on the one hand, there is art, there are these cartoons against those representing the state, to hold the state to account, so to speak, art that is meant as a challenge to the unchecked power of the state. And on the other hand, there is also art that is used by those in control of the state, and those, or on behalf, I should say, of those in control of that state. And I think what we're going to hear about a lot today is that former perspective. You know, those that oppose the state. If I look at the panelists and the subjects of the panels, you know, we'll hear a lot about how art is used, can be used against the state as a corrective, in a sense, to the narrative of the state and of the narrative that the rulers of those states put forward. But, and in particular, since I've been working on the Arab Gulf and travel to the Gulf quite frequently, I also wanted to say a quick word about the second dimension of the politics of art. Art in the Middle East that is either used by those in control of the state or on behalf of those in control of the state. What has become a very pronounced, even crucial part, I would argue, of the politics of art in the Middle East. And here in particular, I would like to draw your attention to the Arab Gulf, where enormous amounts of money are being spent, a lot of it on Western or Western-inspired art, and of course, I include architecture here as a form of art. For anyone who is familiar with the Arab Gulf countries, this raises a number of very interesting questions, of which the following three random ones only represent the tip of the iceberg. Why are the UAE and Qatar interested in establishing satellites of the Guggenheim, the Louvre, and other Western cultural institutions in their country, each of which cost hundreds of millions of dollars? Why is it that there are new museums in Doha and on Sariyad Island in the UAE dedicated essentially to Western art? And why are the urban landscapes of Dubai Doha, and even Riyadh, increasingly punctuated by the designs of people like Frank Gehry, I.M. Pei, Rem Koolhaas, and other celebrity international architects. And so before I try to give a very cursory answer to that question, let me point out perhaps the incongruity of what the Arab Gulf states are trying to do. It is incongruous because in many ways this kind of state-sponsored art is as subversive as the art that targets the state. It presents and introduces a kind of cosmopolitanism shared only by local elites that stands in danger of clashing with the semi-traditional societies on which it is superimposed, or perhaps better, stands in contrast to. And it is perhaps therefore not so surprising that simultaneously, as a possible corrective to increase legitimacy for local royal families, at the very moment that ruling families, particularly in the UAE and Qatar, are pushing toward their vision of what modern society should be like, they are deliberately, even ostentatiously, using art as an expression of that vision, that at the same time an intense effort at the retraditionalization of local societies is taking place. I'm thinking here of the creation, for those of you who have traveled in the Arab Gulf, the creation of heritage villages, Turat, heritage being the mot du jour right now in the Arab world. I'm thinking of the sponsoring of what are labeled traditional cultural practices that allegedly find their origin in the past of local tribal societies. I'm also thinking, for example, of the restoration of Bastakea in Dubai and the inner core of Doha. The building of international museums in the Gulf, much like their international universities and zero-carbon cities, in many ways reflect the desire by local governments to comply with Western-defined liberal international norms and tastes to gain international recognition, and in several ways reflect what I, as a political scientist, see as a very problematic broader pattern of semi-failed state building. The acquisition and display of art in the Gulf is meant overwhelmingly for an audience that is international rather than local. Indeed, what has always struck me when visiting these museums and displays of Western art, the Doha Tribeca Film Festival, the exhibition of international renowned artists, of which Jonathan has written very eloquently when he interviewed Jeff Koons, is that this particular expression of the politics of art, the modernist international one, leaves most local citizens profoundly indifferent. All of these, the building of cultural, social, and educational enclaves, most often divorced from the rest of each country's social and urban fabric, are part and parcel of the global soft power ambitions of these local states. Ambitions that, judging from the one country where citizens have a formal political say in the Gulf, that is Kuwait, they themselves, the citizens themselves, clearly view as harmful to their national and cultural identity. The bottom line, I think, here for us is that art, particularly in the Arab Gulf, and particularly by local elites, has become valued as a commodity that can be used instrumentally for what one of my colleagues calls a quest for significance, to which I would add also a quest for legitimacy. So art in the Middle East, the production of art, what art is allowed to represent, what art really represents beyond the physical object that is being produced, and how art reflects both power and politics in the Middle East, all of these represent, I think, a number of very important questions and raise a number of issues that undoubtedly today's panels here will try to address. And so without much further delay, let me give the floor then to Jonathan and to today's panels, and thank you all again for coming.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out so early. As a Cairene, 9 o'clock on a Friday is super early, so I'm really grateful you're all here. I'm especially grateful for ICWA, the Institute of Current World Affairs, for Dirk, our chairman, Edward, our executive director, and the whole staff who made this happen, Jessica, Saira, and Ellen. I'm really glad we have this full room to talk about what I think are ideas that aren't always raised in Washington. And I hope that's really one of my goals today, is to kind of raise new conversations that are often absent from the Beltway. For the past 2 years, I've been based in Cairo in traversed from Algeria to Dubai and Doha and many times to Beirut, often asking the same questions. What is the role of the artist today? And not just in the Middle East, but what is the role of cartoonists? What is the role of novelists? And thinking about these fields as not static, but within a bigger ecosystem of media and journalism, as well as creative production. And I just really wanted, I don't want to take time away from our panels, but I really wanted to bring these conversations to light, bring some friends who I really admire. That was the idea of today's conference. So I don't want to steal any time from them. And I've given quite a lofty title to my talk, How to Curate a Revolution. And I don't intend to answer that question today. But I wanted to provide kind of 3 provocations based on, in fact, 5 years of being a writer and a journalist in Cairo and interviewing dozens of artists and cartoonists especially. One thing I've noticed, and I studied in Cairo previous to the revolution in 2007. I returned in 2012 and have since then kind of created a project that many people were working on, but I've devoted 5 years to researching creative dissent, creative production in the Middle East. One thing I noticed is that revolutionary Cairo or post-revolutionary Cairo isn't all that different than pre-revolutionary Cairo. And these labels are quite obscuring of the fact that these are Western imposed narratives sometimes, that we have some artists today like Ganzir and Ali Abdel Mohsen who might be called revolutionary artists. Sorry, I got excited. I think we all know that 6 years since the uprising, the revolutions are definitively stagnant or dead, or the swamp of the Mubarak years has returned with the swamp of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's resurgent autocracy. So I kind of want to eschew these labels today and have conversations that begin with the artists and the writers and the critics themselves, and not with these outside labels of, this is revolutionary art. So that's part 1. Part 2 is there's a new recognition right now in the region, and increasingly in Europe and across the world, of trying to understand Arab modernism and what happened in mid-century Cairo, Beirut, Baghdad, North Africa, Damascus. What were the modernists doing? What was happening from World War II onward to the '67 war? And with that becomes market forces, this huge push to collect, the role of Sotheby's and auction houses, the role of blue chip galleries. But I want to say this is another way to curate a revolution. It's impossible to think about the 2011 uprisings without thinking about what happened in the 50s in Egypt, without thinking about the 1967 struggle from all of its dimensions. And here we are 50 years since then. One recent sort of very hip topic, which I've written about, is a group of Egyptian surrealists who were working in the 30s and 40s in Cairo. And I think they challenge a lot of our preconceptions of the Middle East. They were working hand in glove with surrealists in Paris and in London. They were writing manifestos that were every bit as harsh and poignant as anything else that was published. And actually, I really like their art. I think it's really terrific. There's 2 exhibitions this year that are quite massive. One by the Sharjah Art Foundation, and one at the Pompidou, and is now traveling through Europe. So I was wondering, why did this happen? Why are these 2 massive exhibitions about this little-known movement from the 30s popping up today? And I don't think that I have, the precise answer, but it goes back to some things Dirk was saying about the way Gulf money and a search for identity as being reappropriated. And they're seeking, these Gulf states are seeking identity through other Arab histories, pardon me, because there isn't a rich artistic culture from mid-century Dubai. In fact, there isn't much of anything from mid-century Dubai. So people are going into other directions. And a writer I really admire, Ahmed Nagy, who was in prison for much of 2016, Egyptian writer, he said there's a black hole in the identity of many of these Gulf states. And looking to mid-century Arab art and culture in Egypt, in Beirut, and elsewhere becomes a way to think about it. My third provocation is that art isn't something for us to extract the politics from. It's not something for analysts and and writers here in Washington to say, this is how the region looks based on these paintings or these novels. I think art has a huge value unto itself. And the second we begin to say that we're looking at these things for a political understanding of the region, it takes a huge amount away from them. So that's why I really wanted to make this conversation begin with writers and painters and comic artists and critics whom I admire, because I think that's the best way to have this conversation. So as we're grappling with a lot of these questions, I'm sure some of you might feel echoes with some of the big political questions of the moment in America, because art is sometimes given this role as, can it serve the resistance? Does art have to have a political value? Does art have to respond to the questions of the moment? And I don't purport to have a solid answer to any of these questions, but I hope that we can learn a lot from some of our esteemed panelists today, and obviously we want to hear your questions and perspectives. So thanks very much. I'm really excited to welcome one of my colleagues. I've been an editor with this journal called the Cairo Review of Global Affairs for the past 5 years. It's based at the American University in Cairo. It's a small team. There's just 3 or 4 of us, and we put out this incredible quarterly journal, bringing in people like Bill Gates and Jimmy Carter alongside people like Guyer and up-and-coming Egyptian writers. So one of our contributing editors, Rosina Ali, is here. She'll be moderating our first panel. Rosina is on the editorial staff of The New Yorker. Previously, she was a deputy editor with the Economist Intelligence Unit. And she's most recently written some really fun pieces for The New Yorker, one about the sort of fraught politics of Showtime's Homeland program, one about Rumi's poetry and rethinking the poetry of Rumi, and I'm really thrilled to welcome her. So come on up, Rosina.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Jonathan, thank you for that introduction. I am thrilled to welcome on stage Yasmin Al-Rashidi. She is a writer based in Cairo. She is the author of The Battle for Egypt, a series of dispatches from the 2011 revolution, and is a contributing editor at Badoon, a Middle East culture quarterly. She is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and was a former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal covering the region. Most recently, she made her fiction debut with her novel Chronicles of a Last Summer. So please join me in welcoming her on stage.
I'm going to skip that part.
How do we turn these on? Are these on? Okay.
Present you some juices while you're waiting. Oh, sweet, thank you. Is it on?
Yeah. I just dropped mine, sorry.
Can you hear us?
Is this okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. So Yasmin, I'm going to be a bit unfair and start with a really difficult question. A lot has happened in the past 6 years.
Use your microphone, please.
Is this better? Better? No? Should I just hold it? Okay. All right. Is this good? Yeah? All right, great. It's good, interactive. Okay. I wanted to ask you, as a writer, how do you take stock of what's happened in the past 6 years? Or, if you look at it a bit more continuously since even before 2011, if you had started seeing major shifts in Egypt?
That's such a difficult question. I mean, to start with, I just want to thank Jonathan for organizing this and having us and everyone else involved. Jonathan is like one of those rare people who managed to somehow become part of the fabric of Cairo that I know, which is like a feat. I mean, going back to your question, it's really, I think one of the things that I've been trying to do, and it's difficult has been to resist thinking of things through the prism of 2011. And I say that having, obviously, I wrote about everything that was happening for the New York Review of Books. And so it really took over and consumed my life. And I think for all of us, like, it's impossible. Like, your life is marked by this event. It's marked by that year, but it's also in the narrative of a lifetime. It was a moment, and it was a passing moment. But it was a passing moment, obviously, that marked you in the way that a death might mark you, or and it sort of feels like death. For me, the changes, like, I think I began to be aware of the possibility of change, or the sense of waiting for change, in 2010. And it was this confluence of forces coming together. It was the economy and inflation and rising prices. It was certain statements the government was making. Like, I remember in the summer of 2010, then Prime Minister Ahmed Nazif, people kept complaining about the power cuts and the price of tomatoes. And I remember, like, every few days, like, looking at the newspaper, and on the front page or the second page or third page of the newspaper was a picture of a cart with tomatoes, and the price. And I remember this moment when the Prime Minister said that they could no longer do anything about the price of food. And that was, there was something about that summer where you felt there was this tension rising. The parliamentary elections were upcoming. There was nonstop talk of Mubarak's son taking over. And there was also, I think all of us had this understanding that it was not something that the army wanted or would allow. And so you were aware that something was shifting. And then 2011 came and sort of went. And since then it's been really, it's difficult in that, as a writer, it's been difficult because for this extended moment of time, you felt that what you made and what you did had some sort of direct impact. You actually had some sort of, like, small power, and
As a citizen or as a writer?
As a citizen, but then also as a writer, that there was this discourse. You felt people were taking things in, they were considering them, they were trying to consume as much as possible. And at some point, and I can't mark it precisely, but at some point that broke. And now, it's Ramadan across the Muslim world, and the second day of Ramadan, I was at my aunt's house in Cairo, and there was a cousin there who I haven't seen in a long time, and he's an activist, and was very involved in everything. And I asked him, I said, so what do you think of what's happening? So I meant the political situation, and he looked at me and he said, Yasmin, I don't talk about politics anymore. And you feel that there's this, and I think it's for many reasons. I feel there's a sense of helplessness. I feel there's this sense of being broken or defeated. There's a lot of depression. And so it's, I don't know if I answered your question.
Did you ever remember feeling this sense of helplessness before 2011, when things were similarly felt stagnant?
In a way, yes, I feel that, and I don't, obviously I feel, this is like very personal. Genzir's here and his experience might be completely different, but I feel that it has marked my life. This sense of, sort of a listlessness, not feeling like totally excited about the possibilities in this place where I was born, and I lived my whole life there. And of course, you find a way of, like, living and making a life, but never like feeling a certain level of excitement about things, you know, in terms of the country and making. And so when you experience something like 2011, and when you experience that, for me, that sense of exhilaration and the sense of, you know, so this participatory, you know, experience, and certainly feeling like this during 2011, this is the rest of my life. I'm forever going to be involved in the politics of the country. I'll forever have like a voice and a role, like in some tiny way. I will never leave. To come out of that, in some ways it feels like a return to 2010 and all the years before, but in another way you're sort of forever living in the shadow of knowing what it means to get beyond that. So in a way it's harder, if that makes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You said earlier that you try not to write through the prism of the revolution. Why is that?
So I have this novel that came out last year, and the backstory of the novel is that I was contracted to write a nonfiction book. And, but I had started working on a novel in 2010 that I was trying to make sense for myself of what it was about this place that I was from, that I had a space and a role in it, and that I live in a house that my mother was born in. Like, I have not moved at all. Trying to make sense of what it means to have a space in a country, but also have no space at all, which is this like no man's land that I felt I existed in. And then 2011 happened. I didn't have time for the novel, and then I returned to it, and then I tried to write a nonfiction book. I tried really hard to write a nonfiction book, and it was impossible. And there were a few things that happened. The first was that I understood that to write a nonfiction book, that somehow that I had to put myself in it. Like, I had to be the narrator. And so to do that, I had to write not only somehow about my life, I also had to bring in the lives of people around me, you know, which meant friends, family, but also people whose lives I've been privy to just because I am an Egyptian. And that was, it sort of turned out to be impossible. Like, I couldn't do it. Every time I tried to sort of move into a story write into a story, I found myself blocked. And it felt like it sort of wasn't it was this question of privacy and this question of what information is yours to use or not use. 2011, I feel everything was out there and everyone had an understanding we were all making from it. But to go back to over 30 years or more of a life, that felt like it wasn't, like I was having a hard time with that. And I think it's probably cultural. You know, we're quite guarded about personal lives, and there are lots of taboos. And the second thing that happened was that I realized quickly that there was an expectation of the kind of book that I would write, and the kind of
the expectation from
publishers,
okay.
From editors. I'd been writing for the New York Review of Books. I had a certain voice. I had been writing these pieces that were kind of chronicles in a way, but they were also explanatory. I was in some tiny sense, this bridge of explaining an event to an English reading audience. And I realized that really the book that they wanted from me was an explanatory, definitive, sort of sweeping book on the revolution told through a set of characters, including myself. And I had such a strong, when it dawned on me, and this was through conversations with editors and eventually the publisher I chose to work with, I had such a strong reaction to it. And I realized I just couldn't do that. I think when you're from a place, I think a book like that requires a certain measure of distance. And I realized that if you do that, you are, I think, going back to what Jonathan spoke of earlier, you're kind of creating a quite simplistic narrative that, that a reader can take and with it just think they understand something. And I didn't feel I could do that as an Egyptian. The stakes felt too high. And so I slowly returned to this novel I had been writing. And the novel, in some sense, it's set over 3 summers: summer of 1984, summer of 1998, and the summer of 2014. And so in some sense, it's narrated through this girl growing up. The summer of 2014, you can't set something in the summer of 2014 without taking account the past years, but I don't directly, obviously, address them. And that's, and that's been like and I think that's because I don't want to reduce things. I don't want to reduce a narrative. I feel there are like millions of stories and experiences of revolution. I feel it took, the Western media really wanted characters, and it wanted to give the revolution names and faces, and the fact that I also work that I was reporting and in a more journalistic capacity, I came sort of face to face with these sort of problematics. Like I was asked to help put together a piece for a news magazine. I think it was late 2011. They asked if I could suggest, 8 young activists that they could profile. I sent in the names to this editor in New York. They asked if I could help, do the interviews. If I could conduct the interviews, send them in, and their senior writer would script it into something, which I did. And then they were trying to set up the photo shoots. And they asked if I'd be willing to go to the place where they were going to have the photo shoot. And I went, and the photographer, who's an American who's lived in Egypt for years, took it. It looked like a Rolling Stone cover. It was fantastic. We were all very happy. And then a few days later, I'm copied on this email chain. And of course, I'm at this point, I'm sort of cut out, but I'm copied on the email chain where the editors in New York are saying that they have to redo this and choose other activists because these people are too old. They don't look young enough. And for me, that's why one has to resist all these.
Yeah. I mean, I was struck in your book. I was struck by 2 things. One, I thought you did the impossible, which was make Cairo appear so silent. And everyone should read Yasmin's book. It's wonderful. But just reading it, I realized one of the most overwhelming things about Cairo is just the cacophony of sound. And your book did away with that, and with very interesting strategies too. I mean, you did away with dialogue, even. That was a great strategy and very effective.
It's only because I don't know how to write dialogue.
But the second thing that really struck me was that the narrator seemed so distant from what was happening, and presumably your work as a journalist would allow you a distance, and fiction to me just seems so much more personal. And I'm curious to understand why you thought fiction would allow you that distance that nonfiction couldn't.
I think it's the two things. One is that it's very uncomfortable for me, maybe us, I don't know, to delve into the personal. I feel that there's, I don't know, I think it's cultural, protective of, or you're raised to feel protective of the family and the community and privacy, and you always have to, you don't deal with the hard truths. I mean, there's 1,000,002 social taboos and cultural taboos, and some people, I have a few friends who have broken through that and deal with them and write, but I obviously haven't. And I just couldn't. It was also that when you use yourself and to write a whole nonfiction book where you are essentially the narrator, I felt it again, it risked being the, what do they call, I hear this all the time here, the native informant, native narrator. It collapses something, and I feel reduces a story into possibly being, oh, here's the book by the Egyptian girl about the revolution. This is the story of Egypt, and this is the story of, and I have a very strong reaction to that. Fiction, it's become something completely different. Fiction is, I think it definitely gives you a freedom. You don't feel that you're using people around you or the lives around you in this, in the way that I think journalism, I find myself feeling that I'm doing that. And then there's a very different freedom in terms of form, obviously, and also what you can tackle. I mean, it's interesting what you say about the silence. I was really interested in our silence. That's what I became preoccupied with. I was preoccupied less with what are the events that led up to us taking to the streets and voicing ourselves. I was much more interested in, culturally, how do you raise a generation to be essentially muted? Because in some sense we were muted for all those years. And to swallow that, like, we really were swallowing ourselves, which in some sense we're doing again now. And fiction seemed to be the only form where you could, for me, where you could explore the minutiae, the sort of the everyday interactions that I think form an individual and come to make you who you are. I'd already written the more pragmatic stuff that looked at the parameters of the political situation, the economic situation for the New York Review of Books, but I feel that it's something much, much deeper that makes the culture and the society what it is, and that can begin to explain the 30 or the 50 or the 60 years preceding 2011, and that also I think then can help illuminate on where we are now, which is in quite a similar space to, we're silent again, I think.
And is that a form of self-censorship, that silence, or is that out of, as you kind of mentioned earlier, this just feeling helpless about politics?
I think it becomes, I think silence becomes in a way a form of complicity, and which I try to grapple with that a tiny bit in the book, is that you're silent also about things like small, we feed into a system that corruption is a part of the system. To get anything done in Egypt, you bribe, you give money, but it's a bribe. And in very small ways, but you're complicit with something, or when something happens in front of you and you don't speak up because you haven't been raised to speak up, it becomes in some sense a form of complicity, even it's not the intention. For me, there has been self-censorship about certain things. That I begin to touch on in the book, but that I probably wouldn't feel entirely comfortable addressing in nonfiction in a straight journalistic way. Well, let me give you you know, the book is being translated into Arabic, and I got the sheet from the publisher with all the things, the stuff in Arabic that we couldn't say. And the book is a very quiet book. There's nothing like, you know, it's a very, very quiet book. I don't think there's anything in it that would, you know, irk the government but, you know, that there's a passage on Arabs and the Jews and this comparison of them and all the things in that passage that we can't, you know, that we can't have, or words that we can't use. We can't use, they don't want me to use Israelis for the word, like literally the word Israelis. They don't want me, there's a passage about this crackdown on the Queen Boat, which was this place where gay men used to go at night. They don't want me to use the word gay. They don't, you know, there are these things that, just these words that you can't even use, you know, and that for your whole life somehow you've been told you can't speak these things. Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, it's not conscious self-censoring, but I realized that when you're raised in an environment where there are all these things that you're not supposed to speak about or not supposed to touch on, you learn this when you're very young. And that's why my book starts with, you know, it's a 6-year-old narrating the first part, because I wanted to understand, what does it mean to grow up in an environment like this? At the age of 6 or the age of 7, what is happening around you that you're taking in that turns you into the person who you are later on?
Who are you writing your book for? Did you have an audience in mind?
No, I never thought I didn't even think I'd finish myself. And then also I assumed that since I was supposed to be writing nonfiction, it would be rejected immediately. I mean, no, I don't think I mean, I really wrote it for myself.
The reason I asked this question is because, you know, something that Jonathan mentioned in his introduction was this sense that there are expectations of certain narratives, whether it's a Western audience or whether it's an Egyptian audience. And I'm curious if you see that, and if you see a difference in what narratives are expected between these two groups.
Definitely. I mean, I think in narratives for the West, they want you to explain things. And I mean, my book, I don't think explains a lot. And that was I mean, I got a lot of criticism about many things, and one of them was that I don't explain. Like, how do I expect people to understand all these, you know, historic events when I haven't explained? When I did submit the manuscript in, my agent assumed that my contract would be canceled, and she was worried about this. So she submitted the manuscript to a lot of other editors. And the things that came back were, well, we like this writing, but you can't have a book coming out of Egypt now that does not have a chapter on the revolution. So why doesn't she include a part 4 in the place of part 3 that is summer of 2011? And I got this all the time. I think when you're writing, I don't think about, when I'm writing, I occupy a strange space, obviously, in that I write in English. Yeah. So I'm aware that there is the world that reads in English, and there's a small community in Egypt that also reads the English. I'm much more conscious about my small community. Like, that's what I care about, and it's what I also, you know, you have this responsibility. You're putting possibly people's lives on a page, and I'm much more sort of attuned to that.
A couple of years ago, when I was living in Cairo, I had a conversation with the writer Izzeddin Shukri Fashid, mm-hmm. and he was telling me that he thinks how people see 2011 is very much dependent on how they see what came after. Mm-hmm. And that's how they'll narrate it. And it's an interesting thought, because I wonder if you had written the book in 2011 or 2012, would it have changed? Because it came out in 2015, is that right? Yeah. Would you have written it differently? Would the revolution have been more prominent?
think if I had been writing the book in 2011 and not writing my stuff for the New York Review of Books, it would have probably been a nonfiction book that was just a chronicle of things as they happened. I don't think, I can't imagine it would have been fiction. But, you know, how 2011 is read is also, I think, a little bit affected by generation. I'll never forget my father through 2011, especially at the beginning. He was so skeptical, and it was so frustrating because I was so excited. And every time I'd call him and say, "Oh, this happened," and I was out, and you know, I bumped into this person, and they said X and Y and Z, and he just kept repeating this. And I put this in the book under like one of the characters. He just kept saying, "We've lived this all before. My generation has lived this all before," you know, because they lived Nasser, and Nasser's revolution was very, very different, but there was this sense of, I think, possibility from what I understand from him and from everything I've read, because of what a visionary Nasser was, you know, and how charismatic he was. There was a sense of he really mobilized his youth. And my father was very much swept up in that. And then, of course, and then it was shattered with the defeat of 67, you know, and so and my father kept raising this, and now he talks about it, how that sense of possibility and then was probably the sort of mirror moment to what we lived in 2011, and this sense of being broken came for them with 67. And I think 67 is a huge, huge part of our story as a generation who did not live it. Because we were raised in these homes by parents who were very affected by that. And I think the national psyche on some level was very affected. And you can't, you know, it sort of seeps into who you are. I think this listlessness, the sense of the lack of possibility, I look at the older generation, I feel that there's a bit of almost a despair. And I'm talking about pre-2011 when I look back at them.
Right. It's interesting when you talk about this this sense of possibility or lack of sense of possibility. And one of the wonderful things about fiction, I think, is that it does allow someone to rewrite an ending, to reject this fatalism that sometimes comes with politics, that seems to be the sense in Egypt right now. And what I find remarkable about your book and some of the other literature coming out, such as The Q by Basma Belaziz, there's this rejection of a resolution. It really allows the readers to interpret what takes place throughout the story. It allows the readers to imagine a different ending that perhaps politics doesn't allow for this time. And I think that's a beautiful rejection of despair. And I think fiction is extremely important in this time. I know there's this sense that, without, at the risk of romanticizing what happened, I think we need to kind of take stock sometimes of what took place in 2011 and recognize that despite everything that came after, a country of 92 million people overthrew a dictator, which is an incredible feat. And even though the politics perhaps did not reflect the social and cultural change, there is this impulse to imagine a different future. And I'm wondering what you're seeing in the fiction coming out of Egypt or from the region, especially with your work at Bethune.
I think the one thing that, fiction, I think it allows you to also then not have your life contained in a narrative that of Egypt that somehow started with 2011 and ended with 2011.
Yeah.
Like when you look at a lot of the literature, academic literature and journalism that comes out on Egypt, you would think that like that was the period of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
There was no real before except in these very broad terms of Mubarak. Like you think that Egypt somehow came into existence with Mubarak and ended with 2011, and I think fiction gives you this space to get far past that. What has been interesting to me is that, and I think this is the thing that cannot be taken away, is that there seems to be a very different sense of freedom or, with this younger generation. Like I feel that they're much less inhibited. And I don't know, and I think they were sort of, and I'm talking about like 16, 17, 18-year-olds who I encounter through Townhouse Gallery that I'm sort of involved with in some ways. And they were really coming of age during 2011. And I look at the things that they're talking about and what they're writing and the art they're making. And I'm not interested in this idea, these what's good and what's bad and what's good art, and I'm like really interested content-wise what's coming out is that, and what gives me a sense of sort of hope is that they're dealing with things that certainly my generation never dealt with. They're dealing with issues of gender and sexuality, and they're dealing with these cultural constructs that have trapped us in. They're like breaking them in certain ways. And so rather than sort of a specific writer or a specific, I think that for me that's what is most moving to me. And you go and sit, Townhouse Gallery, I'm sure some of you know, it's situated downtown, sort of maybe 10 minutes from the square. And it's at this like crossroads at the end of two lanes with mechanic workshops and coffee shops, and they had this unfortunate incident where it had two spaces. One was a building, like a 4-story building, and the other was almost like a warehouse space, like a factory space. Part of the building collapsed. Was it this year or last year?
This year.
This year, and so now they're just in that factory space, which is sort of on just at the end of that crossroads. And you sit there on any given day, and the number of young people who either know of the space or don't know of the space, but happen to be walking by through downtown, who come in and, will go and pick a book off the bookshelf or ask a question, or is astounding to me. Like I remember, I've been involved with the gallery for many, many years, and pre-2010, 11, to me it felt like it was a sort of different demographic. These are much, much younger people, they're much younger, and they're just like they're much less inhibited.
What do you think accounts for that shift in demographic? Is it the type of artwork that's premiered at Townhouse, or is there something else?
I just wonder if this generation, and I don't want to speak in terms of like broad terms, and I hope I'm not, I don't want to make generalizations, but I just wonder if there's something in this younger generation that if something of the past has been broken in terms of the freedom that they feel, despite the political situation and despite the crackdowns and despite the censorship, when I look at what they're sort of dealing with and this sense of they're obviously liberated in a very different way. They don't seem to worry as much about what their family will think or their parents will think. I just wonder if it's something that came with sort of coming of age at that moment. I was having a conversation with William Wells, the director of Townhouse, which we did it for Badoon, which we published. And he said, and he deals with these people every day, you know. He said that what he sees is very different is that there's also, economically, there's no possibility, there's no sort of possibility anymore for a parent to give to a child unless you're, I was like, you know, in this tiny one, if you're in the 1%. And so in the past, the son still expected that the father would buy the apartment, even if it's like the one-room apartment somewhere, that they would help him, you know, a little bit financially, and with whatever it is, £1,000 or £10,000, to set up a family, and, you know, when he gets married and have a small wedding, and that there isn't that possibility anymore. And so something, you know, that, you know, something has been broken in terms of that tie, and they're out there on their own. Mm-hmm. And I see it even in, I mean, my family sort of, there are some people in my family who have more money and some people who don't. But I was, at that same Ramadan iftar, one of my cousins was there. He's in his mid-30s. He has his own business. He has historically done quite well, but is not wealthy by any measure, but has lived very comfortably. And he was saying, he said, you know, I can barely support my family anymore. There are some months where I do not make enough income to cover all the expenses, the school fees and the, and that's also something that's, you know, sort of shifting, that the family isn't, the family unit, I think, maybe is changing a bit.
Well, talking about class and townhouse, one thing that I was struck by when I spoke with William, actually I spoke with him twice, once in 2014 and then again last year. It's funny, our conversations differed quite a bit. In 2014, we were talking about how the revolution had kind of limited access and really isolated groups, social and class groups in Cairo, just because of the physicality of the city, just because of the fact that Tahrir became so fortified, and it would be difficult sometimes to get through the square and, you know, to a townhouse, for example. And he told me that he found it amusing when groups from Zamalek would come to downtown, and Tahrir became almost a spectacle rather than a living space in the city for them. And you know, I've been thinking a lot about who is the art for. When we talk about art after 2011, there's an impulse to talk to, you know, connect it, of course, to the revolution, which is, of course, people's uprising. But who are the people, especially after? Like, whose voices are really reflected in the art world? And I think this is, you know, I know that you want to reject having a dominant narrative or presenting a dominant narrative in your work, but I think that also is reflected in just the physical space of the city and how mobile it is for people. And this is something that William was really concerned about in 2014. In 2016, we spoke right after Townhouse was raided by authorities, and it was closed down for, I believe, a couple of weeks. And he told me that one of the reasons he thinks it was raided was because it's a salon for so many different people, across class, across you know, across generations. And
That's true.
And
Which terrifies them.
Exactly, it terrifies them.
They are so scared.
And you know, the way he was talking about everything after, it just sounds almost comical, because he was saying no one would give them a reason for why they raided a townhouse and closed it. So they kept going to every department, and every department kept saying, oh, it's not, we didn't do it, go to the next department.
That's, I mean, what you're seeing now, the crackdown on the arts and on literature, the censorship, I don't even think it's that they think this stuff is dangerous. They just don't understand it, and they don't know what to do with it. And which is, I think it was either 2009 or 2010, there's an artist, Ayman Ramadan, who works out of Townhouse, there was this American, Swoon, do you know her? Mm-hmm. She does these like stencils she became famous in New York at some point, and she had come and done this residency in Cairo, and this young Egyptian artist was very inspired by her, and he decided to make his own stencil and go and spray paint it on walls around downtown. And the police wake up one day, I guess, and suddenly there's this like thing stenciled on all these walls downtown, and they panicked. And they started looking for the person. They couldn't find him, but they managed to get to one of the people who had physically helped transport the stencil around. And eventually they got to Townhouse, and they were looking for Ayman. And William called me, and he said, and Ayman is terrified, because he had been arrested and I guess tortured before. He's terrified. He has to go and hand himself in because they're going to get him anyway. He's scared to go alone. Can you go with him? I'm like, okay. So we went, and William couldn't go because he's Canadian, and it sort of doesn't make sense. So I went with him, and we were in that police station for hours, almost 24 hours, just sitting around waiting, and you could hear these like snippets of conversations by officers when they'd look into the room and see us there and ask who we were, and someone else would say, oh, they're those art people, and you'd hear the conversation of what they thought that stencil was. And the stencil was of a street sweeper, so it's like a figure with a broomstick. But they thought maybe it was the Egyptian flag has that eagle in the middle. Maybe it was the eagle of the Egyptian flag, but with his wing broken, so it was this whole thing to bring down the state, I feel that...
Talk about projecting an imposing narrative.
And the colors were communist colors. And so I feel that what's happening now, it's a bit like Nasser did this also, is that they don't, like Sanala Ibrahim's novel, That Smell, you can feel the tension in that book, which was censored as soon as it came out. You can feel a tension in that book, but you can't quite place it. It was immediately censored, and I feel a lot of what's happening now, as I see it, it's sort of a similar thing. Tamer Said's film, In the Last Days of the City, which they won't, it's this film that was shot in 2008, 2009. The filmmaker made a decision, he didn't start editing it until after 2011, but made a decision to stay true to the original vision of the film. They won't let it be screened in Cairo, in Egypt. And it's the same thing. It's a very, in ways it's a quiet film. It's like very subtle, but there's a tension in it, and you can't quite place the tension. And it's an everyday narrative. It's like totally quotidian. The footage is from before 2011, but there's this tension, and it terrifies them, Look, I'm sorry I jumped. You were talking about the physicality of the city. I mean, the question of access to art, I think that, Genzir is sitting here, and I hope he will talk about it, but I think what happened with 2011 is suddenly there was a very different, access and narration of something through this art that, and I hate the word representation, but it resonated with people in a very, very different way. I think because it was made in this different space, it was accessible to everyone. Somehow it was being made out of and from the city and from the everyday. I mean, it was something that everyone felt was both theirs and of them and for them, and that changed something. And I remember sort of going from my house down the Nile to Tahrir and then on to Heliopolis or whatever, and all these amazing, I mean, they're not murals, what are they? All these amazing works of art, just you'd find them overnight, they'd pop up, and like the people that would like really crowd it around, like really taking the time to sort of look, and because they were just very much, I think, a part of, I think they belong to people in a different way, and in the way that when you walk into a gallery, townhouse of the past was much more of a gallery space, and you'd walk in for an exhibition and you'd look, and it was much less accessible. This shifted something.
But these murals are being painted over, right? Or are they still?
Constantly. I mean, there are some on that wall of AUC that seem to have been there for a while. I don't know if any of you can see it. They're still. I mean, there was a period where you'd wake up in the morning and they'd be painted over in white or black, and a few days later there's something again and they'd paint over. Now I think they're more scared of other things.
Yeah.
Or they seem to be more scared of other things.
Yeah.
And now I think there's also, under Mubarak, when you're writing or making, you had a clear understanding of what the red lines were. Like, I worked for a local newspaper for many years, and I knew I could write and I couldn't write, and if I wanted to push the boundaries a bit, where I could go, and at what point the editor would say no. And now and it was all political. It was, key figures that you could or couldn't criticize, and things you could or couldn't write about, like the Egypt-Israel gas pipeline that you could not touch. And now it's gone beyond politics. Now it's also about like morality. Who you are as a citizen. Are you a moral citizen of good standing? And so Ahmed Negi, this isn't a case that was brought. It wasn't started by the state. It was started by another citizen, and it's all about in the end, it's all about morality. Writing this sexually explicit stuff means that morally you are not a person of good standing, and it's this gray area.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it also just seems very arbitrary who they target. And I'm actually astounded that Basma's book, The Q, was not censored in any way, and yet Ahmed Nagi's was.
Yeah, it's completely arbitrary.
Yeah.
I mean, you really have I was talking earlier about like this encounter I had with state security, where it wasn't that they were trying to give me a hard time because they had, it wasn't that they'd read something specific, or they just decided that I looked like the kind of person who might be trouble, which is like crazy. But it's also that, it's that for whatever reason, a book or an article or an artwork will get the attention of someone, or a family member will tell the police officer XYZ about something that someone wrote. It's really, there's this idea that it's a big conspiracy, and it's not. It's arbitrary, it's not organized, but there is a paranoia. I think the state is completely paranoid.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're struggling with that here too, is what's more dangerous, an efficient or an inefficient fashion?
Mm-hmm.
We're actually going to open up the floor to questions, if anyone has any questions. And please keep questions brief, and we'll get started. Is there a mic coming around? Oh, there are two mics. So there is a question right there, and then we'll take that one.
For a whole population to be living under that kind of insecurity and pressure, there surely must be issues of mental health. Is any evidence of that showing up in ways that people can recognize?
Did you hear the question?
So I did. That's such a difficult question. I don't know if I have the answer. I started to hear of PSTD in 2012. Suddenly, I felt people were talking about it. It was in the newspapers. It was being written about. Therapy, psychiatrists became like part of a conversation. But I don't know. Maybe you might know. You probably know much more than me.
It's a great question. I actually don't know to what extent PTSD or mental illness started being talked about and how that manifested. But that definitely is something worth exploring more in depth.
Sorry, that's not a very. Maybe Jonathan knows.
We had a question there.
Hey, good morning. I think it's still morning. Yeah. I'm Julian Kyle Lewis. I study international education policy at the American University here in DC. And as President Obama and his wife are finalizing several versions of books that they have coming out very soon about his presidency, one of the things that they're struggling with is how to formulate some of the things that they went through when he was running his campaign, such as, being labeled, as this Middle Eastern guy, this Muslim guy, and the folks saying it had such a confidence that it was gonna strike fear in enough people to get him to vote against him. And I was wondering, if you knew that he was listening right now, just down the street, and he was having a bit of writer's block on how to describe, people inviting him to fundraisers to their homes and having a spread of food and having beef and pork and making the pork look really, really good and the beef look really bad, and film whether he would pick a food, based on, to get him to prove his religiousness, or how would you advise him on how to feel and break that writer's block to get his book finished? Thank you very much.
Wait, if Obama was listening down the street, I'd have a much bigger message for him. But B, I would want to know what his secret is. He is such a gifted writer. Yes. You're more of maybe you have the answer to that question.
No, it's a great question. I think something that we struggle a lot with here, especially over the past couple of years, and I've noticed in the Middle East as well, is this focus on group identity politics. And I think the wonderful thing about fiction is that it allows people to elevate the individual beyond such restraints. And this is a very personal goal, but my attitude has always been the individual first when it comes to writing, because I think that allows writers to reject certain narratives that people want to impose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you write from a personal place, you make something that's very different. And I think, that kind of work, whether it's visual art or literature, I think that's the kind of work that can withstand the test of time. Yeah, I think. There were a lot of books that came out on Egypt in 2011, in the moment, that are gone, because they were written, I think, it wasn't that the desire, they were written from I think it was more, sorry, I'm really jet lagged. I arrived last night. They were written with the desire of capturing that collective, I think, in a very different, and so they passed, because that moment of everyone coming together or also then passes. I think when you write from deep within from a deeper personal place, I think I would tell Obama to just keep doing what he's been doing. I'm sorry, I arrived last night from Cairo, and it was such a long journey. And my brain is slurred. I should have said this at the beginning.
Sorry, I believe we had a question back there.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. And I'm curious, Yasmin, why you write in English, why you chose to write your fiction novel in English. Do you dream in English? And is your book available at Kramer's Books? If I were to, when I leave here, can I pick up your book, or any of us, can we pick up your book at Kramer's Books, which is the closest bookstore to us right now?
Do you know, I have no idea where my book is. It didn't
They should
sell
have
very- Look, most people think my book is really tedious and boring because there is no sweeping narrative, so that's like a pre-warning. I write in, that's the criticism, it's so boring. I mean, for all of you
it's
who
great.
write, like never read those reviews on Amazon, they're so depressing. I write in English because I largely think in English. I went to an English school. My parents had decided that given that my brother and I were, being raised in Cairo, we'd have the Arabic anyway, and the English would be useful to us in the future. But they put us in this school that was, I think it was sort of one of the last standing pillars of colonialism. And so you couldn't even, if you spoke in Arabic, they'd make you do lines after. I will not speak Arabic, I will not speak. And so it sort of became my everyday. And I've thought a lot, my problem now is that I have the vernacular, the colloquial Arabic, but if I were to sit down and try to write in the, the Arabic of like literature, I would be crucified because it would, I would make 1,000,002 mistakes. And so I've thought a lot, and this only came up after 2011 with this different freedom and of writing in the vernacular, which you're seeing. Like I feel more and more people are doing that, and they're returning to what we called the third language, which came up in the 60s and was some combination of those two. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, that I'd slowly like to try to move into that. But I don't feel as confident or comfortable. But my English is also an English that is very much a product of place and culture. These two critics, one of them said, your book's written in English, your book is written of and from Egypt, but it's not an Egyptian novel. And the other one said, it's written in English, but it's not really English, and it's not American English. So I don't know what it is. So it's an English that is formed out of speaking in Arabic every day and having that in the home, but then thinking in English and having to write in English at school. And all this to say, maybe it's not very good.
It's great. I'm sorry, we did have a question right here.
Thank you very much for this. When you were talking about being kind of hesitant and speaking from a personal, your own humanity, I kept getting the feeling that you were trying to avoid writing about anyone, yourself included, that would be endangered by what you wrote. And coming from a place where there is a lot of criticism or, I can't think of the word, where you're coming from censorship. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered if the fear of exposing someone, even yourself, with this fear of something you might express that you really felt, but you knew you couldn't. So I wondered if that figured into the way you write and your hesitancy, or whether, now just speaking about the English and so forth, we know a lot of people who have grown up in one culture and they've learned how to do it very well, but then their primary culture, they can't actually expose themselves in that way.
I mean, there is a bit of fear about certain things that I won't get into because of fear. But there's also fear of offending, and also a sensitivity to difficult experiences. I mean, I have a very close friend of my brother and mine who worked in the Mubarak government. He wasn't in any sort of senior position, but his name was on papers. He was implicated. I remember we woke up one day and his name was along with a long list of other people in the paper that he was wanted. And he he fled, essentially. He went into hiding. And it was, I mean, a lot of things happened then. I think from the stress, his father passed away, he was still in hiding, and his mother got sick, and eventually he came out of hiding, and he was taken to prison, and it was an experience that, because we've grown, I mean, we grew up with him, you know, they're like family. It was something that really marked me and stays with me, and if I felt completely free to write, I would write about those months of living that with them. But I feel it's their experience, and it's so personal, and it's so intimate, and I'm affected, but I will never fully understand how deeply they were affected and how they still live with it every day, as much as I talk to them. And so I feel things like this, it's also just about, I think, a respect for that. So there is partly fear about certain issues, but it's also really partly fear of offending.
We have time for one more? Sorry, I believe you had your hand up too. Maybe you could take 2 short ones.
Hi, thank you very much for your comments. I was really struck by what you're talking about, how fiction provides unique opportunities to kind of stay in front of the ambiguity and the tension of a situation in a way that other media and genre don't. I was interested, we talked about this a little bit already in one of the previous questions, but about the role that education plays for you personally and also more societally in opening up kind of that horizon of different genre and different artistic means of exploring that. In my limited experience of looking at education in the Arab world, a lot of times it seems kind of narrower, not opening up that aperture. So from a personal perspective and societal perspective, what role do you think education plays? Does kind of an experience of Western liberal art education tradition, is that kind of necessary? Is that significant in opening up that possibility?
I mean, I think our sort of best, most interesting artists, writers, don't have, like, you know, went to probably Egyptian public schools and, you know, were I mean, I want to say education is really important because it is, but then when I look, I feel that it's oftentimes a set of circumstances around you in a home or in a community that might in some way, that marks you or might break you, or, you know, difference, I think, in whatever way you may feel different in a community sometimes also you know, makes out of you the artist. Education is, I think, critical in terms of exposure, like having access. And so what I'm seeing now is that, like, we need an overhaul of our education system in Egypt. It's terrible. But young people seem to have so much more access to information because of the internet and because of a million other things that I mean, when I sit and talk to, you know, I go around interview people, and I try and speak to young people more and more. They're like, I don't know, when I was 10 or 11 or 12, I didn't know a fraction of what they know now. And so I feel that, you know, self-education seems to be more the way of the present and maybe the future. Maybe you have a better answer.
No,
Sorry,
I was also thinking about how there's usually such a strong connection and interaction between universities and the city. And a few years ago, the American University in Cairo moved out to New Cairo. And it's about an hour, on a good day, an hour away from Tahrir. It could take an hour and a half in traffic sometimes too. But you know, when I was there, I was wondering about the long-term implications of that, because it is difficult to get to. People who are outside of the university wouldn't readily go to AUC. So you don't really have that same level of interaction in terms of art, in terms of public lectures. And it's going to be interesting to see what that means long term for larger Cairo.
It was the worst thing they did.
I agree.
Although my mother teaches adults continuing education, and they still have that downtown. And you feel that, but it does change. Like they'll go for their class and they'll go to maybe something that's on the AUC downtown, but the library, all the resources are literally in the middle of the desert. So.
We had another question.
You alluded to morality as a political tool, and sexuality always seemed to play a role in all those developments in Egypt. Right? There was sexual violence during the uprising, both from the state and so from demonstrators. And what do you think is the role of sexual frustration today in Egypt?
I mean, maybe Jonathan wants to answer that. I don't know if I want to answer that as a woman. Maybe you have thoughts. I find, and I really, I try and resist talking about these issues, but there is, it's hard being a woman in Egypt. And it's hard because, I feel that one is you're like constantly objectified. Like every step you take, you are objectified, and it can be extremely aggressive. I am a very calm, laid-back person, but twice in my life I have turned around and hit someone, which is, and it's not that it was two incidents of, people trying to grab me but it's these things that build up and build up and build up, and then you just can't take it anymore. And so I think it's an issue. But then you hear stories about how all these young people everyone's sleeping with everyone else, and I'm beginning to hear conversations that I don't feel I heard before, like just young people on the street talking about the boyfriend or the girlfriend, or, this last summer overhearing these three girls talking about, this was downtown on one of these street-side coffee shops, talking about some guy that one of them liked, and the other one said, well, but they think you're bisexual, and she said, so what? These things that you would never hear before. Or not that long ago, a few weeks ago, I was in a taxi on my way to Townhouse, and the taxi driver was on the phone, and it sounded like he was talking to a lover. It was like this sweet talk. I couldn't fully make it out. And then I could hear him say, but I can't see it. You didn't send it. And then he said, it didn't arrive. So I'm assuming someone's sending him a picture. And I couldn't help but look at his phone screen. And it was a picture of the torso of a man. Like he was obviously lying down, and it was his torso up. So it was not even a gay taxi driver, but he, this may or may not be his lover or someone he's interested. Like I feel like, I hear these things and they're around me in a way I don't remember before. But generally, I feel that there's a...
Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. And Yasmin, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Turn it over here to Jonathan in a moment. I just wanted to say something to those of you who are new to ICWA, the Institute of Current World Affairs. This is the organization Jonathan has just returned from. He's been our fellow in Cairo for the past 2 years. We are, and you heard from our chair, Dirk Vanderwall, we are a membership organization, and I urge all of you to go to our website to read more about us, to read more about Jonathan. Just go to our website. He has his own page on our website, and you can join. You can become a member of ICWA. Just go to our website, icwa.org. And with that plug in place, Jonathan, and may I turn it over to you?
Sure. Just have to grab this clicker.
There you go.
Terrific. So I've called this panel Graphic Provocations because I've been working particularly on graphic novels, graphic narratives in the Middle East. But we have with us here a visual artist and comic artist, visual artist and journalist, and a curator and writer. So let me introduce my esteemed panelists, and then we're going to look at some of the art that they've either created or curated. Maimana Farhat is an art historian based in New York and a curator focused on modern and contemporary art. She's the artistic director of I Am Gallery, which was founded in Damascus, now based in Beirut and Dubai. And she's also the editor of Jadaliya's Culture page, which I'm really happy to have contributed one of my first articles to. And she's written widely about modern and contemporary Arab art. We also have Ganzir, who has been called the Banksy of Egypt, but very recently by LA Weekly, but I think he'd scoff at that and say, no thanks. I know him well as a friend, but he's really best known for some of his stencils and graffiti work of the uprising. He's now based in the States, in LA. He's been written about in publications ranging from Art News and Art in America. He's exhibited his works across the world, and he's now hard at work at his first full-length graphic novel called The Solar Grid, which we're going to talk about today. And I also want to introduce you to Ali Abdul Mahsen. He's a writer and a fine artist who I really admire. He recently had a show in Cairo's Mashrabeya Gallery, which is one of my favorite galleries in Cairo. I urge you to check out their website. And his recent show is called The Slow War. And they're really important, poignant works, and that's what he's going to begin our conversation right now. We have some of these works on the screens facing you from his recent exhibition. So, Ali, can you tell us a little bit, tell us about, what are we looking at right now?
Well, that piece specifically was kind of a translation, I guess, of the Last Supper, which is what I was trying to do. But I mean, Slow War specifically was my third exhibition at Mashrabeya, and it was very much a culmination of, the first one I had there happened just as the revolution was, right after the revolution had started, and was very much kind of a knee-jerk reaction from me to what was going on, also because I was reporting on the revolution. The second one was a couple of years after that, and the initial idea was I thought it would be interesting to have 3 shows throughout the years after the revolution to kind of just tell that story, not necessarily of what had happened, but just the changes that I was kind of experiencing and seeing around me. And I wanted them to be a year apart. But when it came time for the third one, I was moving around a lot, and there were personal issues that kept me from getting to it. It ended up being a lot later than I wanted it to. So it was a sense of kind of putting together the last stage of the story that I wanted to start off with, but at the same time getting back to, there had been a sense of there's going to be a conclusion to what we were going through in 2011.
Well, tell us a little bit about your method. You work on cardboard, actually.
Yeah.
And it gives a kind of quality of a triptych or kind of a story. But why do you work on cardboard? What's the story of your practice of making these really gritty, intricate drawings?
I mean, cardboard is for multiple reasons. First of all, the work that I started doing just on traditional materials didn't feel to me like it was actually getting or giving the impression that I wanted it to. Egypt, very few things in Egypt are used for their actual purpose. There's a very, very strong sense of just improvising things. And having this work on the canvas and on paper and stuff, it felt to me like it didn't really match. This was more in the spirit of things. And I don't know, like a good example, and again, the art and the journalism happened at the same time for me. So I remember when I was thinking about the cardboard, there were the elections going on, parliamentary elections the first time. And I remember talking to people about how all the posters that the candidates would use and all like the vinyl materials and stuff, a lot of people in the impoverished neighborhoods would be very excited when the candidates would be down there and would like put the posters up in their neighborhoods, even though they couldn't care less about the candidates. It was because they'd use the posters for roofing. The children actually would take all the posters down, cut it up, and sell it. And people would buy this like patching for the roofing, or for fruit vendors would use it for like their goods or whatever. I feel like that spirit is in pretty much everything. And I kind of wanted to address that. At the same time, also, just everything is packaged in cardboard and as a commentary on just the kind of world that we're living in, the life that we're living in.
Well, you can kind of get a sense of it from these images on the screen, but when they appeared in Mashrabiya Gallery, which is just steps from Tahrir Square in Cairo, it's cardboard boxes hanging on the wall. It gives a quite visceral feel, a visceral narrative. It's not the kind of hoity-toity high art one might imagine in a private gallery. You can see, I remember I was talking with you at the opening and you said, well, there's some cigarette butts mixed into the paint, and there's some, who knows, blood, guts, and whatever. I mean, in a way, there's a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
So next up, these are yours, right? I can't see.
No, these are still mine.
These are still yours?
Yeah.
Okay. Maimuna, tell me about, there's a Palestinian artist who you've been working with closely for several years. We were talking about it yesterday, you've just edited and put out her book. Can you tell us about her and this project?
So her name is Samia Halabi, and she was born in, sorry, I'm very, very, very bad with mics. She was born in Jerusalem in 1936 and moved to the US via Lebanon in 1951. And her family settled in Cincinnati, Ohio. So she was trained as an artist here in the States, and she lived in New York. She moved to New York from Ohio in the 70s, and then was a professor at the Yale School of Art for many years. But while she was working in New York, she was constantly rejected by the New York art scene. One, because she's very, very outspoken feminist woman. She's Palestinian, very outspoken about that. She's also a Marxist. So there are all these different sort of factors that made her kind of rejected by the mainstream art scene in New York. So she started showing in the Arab world in the 70s. And to make a long story short, she became a very influential abstract painter in the Arab world, and is finally gaining recognition at 80 years old in that specific scene. And in 1999, she had a friend who was from the village of Kafr Qasim in Palestine, and it's a border town. And there was a massacre there in 1956 of 51 civilians by the Israeli border police. And so the friend was urging her to come to the village and to interview the family members of victims or even survivors of the massacres, and to document it. And Samia, mostly working in abstraction, it was a bit of a challenge for her. I mean, obviously you see from the images she had the skill set, she's academically trained as an artist. But for her, she had to find a different kind of approach. Her abstraction is based on reality, but again, it's non-objective painting. So, she relies on using the form of abstraction to kind of stimulate or simulate things found in nature in the modern world. So for her to turn to figuration, it took a lot of research for her. And so finally, through trial and error, she decided that she would take an approach to figuration that's based on Renaissance drawings. So she went to the village and she researched it. She sat with all of these people and went through the papers of the Communist Party, who were the first to report the massacre in detail. The famous Palestinian writer Emil Habibi is actually the journalist that went to the town right after it happened and recorded the eyewitness accounts of what had taken place. And basically, it was a curfew that was imposed kind of arbitrarily, and there were all these workers outside of the village that were about to return home, and some of their children and their wives had run out to the village to warn them of the curfew, that they needed to get back, and they didn't make the curfew. So the border police just would stop truckfuls of these workers coming home, and which included women, line them up and execute them. So for Samia, it was very difficult because she didn't want to kind of give graphic depictions of what had taken place. She didn't want to depict the gore and she didn't want dead bodies and things like that. So she felt that she would portray the victims kind of moments before their death. So each scene depicts kind of an incident where there was, the massacre was executed. And there are, I think, 12 waves that Emil Habibi first described. And what he meant by that was the 12 sort of incidents that make up the massacre that happened within like an hour period in different locations in the village.
So I think this is going to be one of the themes of our conversation today, is sort of the artist as witness, the artist as observer. And I think it's something Ali, as a journalist who's also created art that inevitably documents this moment in Egypt, some of the artists you've worked with, Maimana. And then I want to introduce you to the work of Ganzir, who's, can you tell us, what are we looking at here?
Does this work? Okay. That was for a show at Safarkhan Gallery in Cairo. I think it was 2013. If I remember
this was
correctly.
The plague is spreading? Is that?
The virus is spreading.
The virus.
What it was called, and I guess the idea was to do something that worked as just a visual art exhibition where you do have paintings hanging on the walls, right? At the same time, using the space itself as some kind of almost turning it into an entire installation. So the gallery itself, this is like 2 floors, so you could see in the background there's like a set of stairs that go upstairs. And the bottom floor is actually opens right onto the street. And I figured, so I'd use the bottom floor to kind of create a series of works, and it's all chaotic and all blends into one another, and they all are more or less tackle the subject matters that are of interest to just the regular person walking down the street. And then you go upstairs, and then upstairs was a very clean, and you had like all the works were on canvas, and they were well spaced, and they all had to do with works that you would typically find in that kind of gallery, actually, in a way, right? Yeah, I don't have a picture of the upstairs.
So this is a piece. We were talking, I think Yasmin and Rosina were talking about the graffiti of Tahrir Square. This is a powerful piece by Ganzir that said, "The army above all." And there's very few pieces left on Muhammad Mahmud Street, this kind of epicenter of quite lethal fighting that happened in the fall of 2011 between protesters and authorities. And this is one of the few pieces of graffiti that remains. Can you tell us about it, Ganzir?
Yeah, this I did it, if I recall, I think it was sometime in 2014. And I mean, it's in a way, it's a way of saying what already is like what was being said and what was being like accepted, which is like, like as you would hear often, even by normal people on the street, which is like the army's a red line. You don't want to talk. We don't talk bad about the military and that sort of thing. So that idea of the army above all, but then just actually translating it into an image, what that means, and with the this soldier sitting above a bunch of skulls is just like making it visual. So it yeah.
And then I'm just going to give you a taste of Ganzir's graphic novel, The Solar Grid, and then we're all going to have a very in-depth conversation about all these really interesting threads. But tell us about this current project of yours, a 450-page graphic novel. What's the...
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting when Yasmin was talking earlier about how her dad would tell her, like, oh, we've lived all of this before. So this is not, it has nothing to do with the Egyptian revolution, but it has a lot to do with the idea of revolution in a way. And in a sense, so the graphic novel is about, it's totally fictional. It's a science fiction thing. It's in the future after the Earth's resources are completely devastated. People migrate to Mars and establish colonies on Mars, but of course not everyone can go to Mars. And of course, most people are in fact left behind on Earth, right? And so, of course, the question of who gets to go to Mars and who gets left behind on a devastated planet becomes an important part of the story. You know, it raises questions of class, race, nationality, and so on. And basically, the Earth is turned into a solar-powered factory, more or less, by way of something called a solar grid, which is a vast network of satellites that orbit around the Earth. And it beams sunlight on the dark side of the planet. So night has been eliminated from Earth. This to power factories, so they're all solar-powered factories that run 24/7. They operate ceaselessly to just produce goods for export to Mars. So solar power will not save us.
So a lot of relevance a day after a certain climate pact has been
right.
essentially voided.
Right. And then the Martians, of course, send their waste back to Earth. And so the story, it follows two orphans who go through the trash, go through the waste to find valuable items to sell. And they come upon something that will put them on the path to destroying the solar grid. So that's the story. And of course, but in terms of what Yasmin was saying about like this idea of other generations, older generations saying like, oh, we've lived all this before. So the way the story unfolds is that we keep going back in time to all the struggles previous to those two orphans, right? Before those two orphans, like way back hundreds of years in the past where people have already tried to stop the solar grid from being constructed or had tried to, a whistleblower who leaked something to the press and so on. So this idea of people, generation after generation after generation, trying to stop this from happening. And it doesn't. It keeps, it happens anyway. And, but it takes these two orphans to bring it down. So it's sort of like this idea of like really long-term struggle, which I think is every single struggle we're going through right now on the planet is probably a long-term struggle. So that's kind of the gist of it.
So one thing I've noticed this morning and more broadly in my research in the region is that there's a lot of crossover between professions, if we want to say that. So Ali is a journalist who's also an illustrator, artist, painter, however we want to define your unique craft. I mean, what do you see as the relationship between journalism and fine art, having you been on both sides of this equation?
For me, it's what you said earlier. It's observing. That's all. You observe what you can, you record it, you document it. How you feel about it, I guess, is a big part of it. Obviously, in journalism, I couldn't really put much of that in there. So for the art instead. But there's very little deliberation between like, I'm gonna do art today, I'm gonna do journalism today, this is what I'm focusing on when I'm doing this. It's just more instinctive. You try to not put that much thought into it. At least that's my strategy. Because otherwise, I don't know, it starts to become something else. It starts to, you have these like roles and you end up getting stuck in them. Whereas if you kind of just leave it open, like I never really put any thought into, oh, I'm a journalist now, I'm an artist now, or doing one over the other.
I mean, tell us a bit about the craft. I think what's distinguished your journalism for what was called the Egypt Independent at the time and Madame Masser more recently is a kind of visceral storytelling. You love to find these stories from corners of Cairo that most people might not traverse. Can you tell us one of those stories?
Yeah, I mean, we were a small team, and I quickly became the person they would send to cover the weird stories. So if someone wanted to fight a lion, I would go talk to that person. If, stuff like that. And that's what I was drawn to. I wasn't necessarily, like, you get the facts and the policies and all that through other means, but the idea of like all these interesting the nuances that kind of make everything the fringe that like no one really looks at, that ends up having such a pivotal role in how everything goes. It's just, it doesn't really get that credit very often. I was interested in that, and I think that very much came across also in the artwork, in the because you're looking at stories and you're trying to build, like, it's not just about interesting characters, because you don't want to like turn actual people you meet into characters that you're exploiting for anything. It's more the sense of, we should be paying more attention to this as opposed to getting caught up in kind of the more meaningless for me, bigger picture, you know? So I don't know, it was all about details. And my writing, whenever I'd write an article, I wasn't so much interested in what is this article about. It's more like, well, what are all the tiny details that I've managed to put in there? With the artwork, it's much the same. Like, I don't ever have a plan for like what a big, maybe twice or 3 times in all the pieces I've ever done, is there a plan for what something's gonna look like. But it's more, I try to create a space to put all these details in. And then when there's no more room for details, that's when it's done. But
Tell us, Maimana, you've chronicled much about contemporary Syrian art and modern Syrian art. And the conversation today has been primarily about Egypt. Sorry for the misnomer, politics of art in the Middle East. But as an expert on contemporary Syrian art, can you kind of give us an overview of, you had mentioned you're quite connected with some of the bridge figures, some of the later generations of Syrian artists who are still active today. And so what do you see from sort of the elderly generation through now in terms of what's happening in the Syrian art space?
It's kind of been a mixed bag. Just prior to the uprising in Syria, Syria was starting to open up quite a bit. And so the gallery I work for was founded in Damascus in 2006 by a Syrian couple who had been living in Switzerland for a very long time and returned and wanted to do something. And they were big art collectors anyway. So they started working with some of these middle figures, you might call them. So they're kind of the link between the period of modernism in Syria and the contemporary art as it emerged, because they studied with some of the leading modernists at the University of Damascus and started working in the 80s. And then they automatically started teaching there as well. So they are these kind of bridge figures. So one of the figures, Safwan Dahul, who's fairly well known in the Arab world, he's a painter. He encouraged the gallerists to kind of take in a younger generation of artists and to kind of nurture them and to work with them. And a number of the older artists were kind of mentors to them after they graduated from the university. So it was a pretty kind of dynamic art scene that was taking place. And those younger artists were developing very quickly, and they were gaining recognition at lightning speed during that time. And then the uprising came, and immediately came the war, and everything kind of just came crashing down. So a lot of them, the majority of them, have left. So there was kind of a disagreement in the very beginning, because in terms of how you document the uprising, how you respond to it, what kind of visuals are needed, what kind are effective. And so very similar to how Samia was kind of working through how to depict the violence of that specific massacre, Syrian artists were debating it publicly, very publicly. I mean, they were having arguments in cafes, they were writing articles back and forth, arguing over exhibitions. In terms of, do you depict the violence? Do you depict the extent of it? So one specific artist who's older, he's in his late 60s, and he was imprisoned for political activity back in the 70s in Syria, and then left to Paris and then came back, Yusuf Abdelki. Immediately when the war started, he started depicting these martyrs and doing it in a very graphic sort of way in terms of showing blood and the real violence of what was taking place. And other artists reacted negatively to that. They said, you know, this is really kind of damaging. We're already witnessing it firsthand, and we're already seeing all these images come out. This isn't bringing us hope. This isn't inspiring us. So it was really interesting at that point in terms of 2012 to 2014. The plus side is that there was like a creative explosion that happened, and where censorship was very, very heavy in Syria. Once the uprising occurred, artists were given kind of license to just go for it, and were inspired, and also part of the political protests and things like that. So if in the beginning there was this optimism that there would be reform and that art could kind of be a vehicle for this in terms of encouraging positive sort of political change, it's gone now. It's because the war is so intense and Syria is destroyed, and so many of them now live not only outside of Syria in the region, but a lot of them have made that migration to Europe, working with people, smugglers, and walking that long trail or whatever. So cynicism has set in, and sort of this overlying sense of mourning as well. So I think right now artists are kind of trying to figure out what the next step is, you know.
And I mean, having spent some time in Beirut over the past couple of years, a lot of Syrian artists that's their outpost. And one artist I really came to appreciate his work, someone named Mohammed Khatia, who, there's a lot of boats, there's a lot of escaping home, there's a lot of water. I mean, obviously it's very politically inflected. Are Syrian artists in exile necessarily political? Or are there artists who are doing work that has, goes beyond the kind of machinations of regimes and civil war? Or are those kind of artists criticized then for not doing it? Or tell us, is the civil war inescapable if you're a Syrian fine artist?
It is kind of inescapable because I think nobody really saw it coming. And the trauma of it has just been so intense and so disheartening that it appears in their work, they dream it, they speak it, it's really, really hard to escape. And I think with the advent of technology and social media, even more so. One artist is in Amsterdam and his wife is in Damascus with their baby because she wasn't able to make the journey with him. And so now they talk via Skype, and that kind of sense of intimacy with Syrians everywhere. And so everyone hears different sort of stories. So everyone's really well connected, I would say, because of social media and things like Skype and those sort of things. So it is inescapable. It's an everyday sort of thing. And like I said, I don't think Syrians were expecting it. It happened very quickly, and the magnitude of it has been just so severe and so insane that it's really difficult to escape. So I would say the vast majority of them are still dealing with it. And again, trying to work through that. What does that mean aesthetically?
Well, I want to bring Ganzir into this conversation because you're working outside of your home country in a different way. You moved to the States, I guess already 4 years ago. And with that comes certain conceptions of what does it mean to be an Egyptian artist working in America? Can you talk about that and sort of the expectation versus what you're doing and what you're creating?
Yeah, I remember when I first arrived in the States in 2014. I was approached by a big gallery in New York to do an art show, and of course there was an expectancy that the subject matter and the topic would of course have something to do with the Egyptian revolution in some way, but of course I wasn't going to do that because it's not the point. I'm not gonna. It's okay. I'm not.
No, we're used to. I mean, I think
insurgency.
The fact that there hasn't been a phone. If we were in Cairo, we would have all been on our phones already.
That's
so
true.
It's no problem.
Yeah, I wasn't going to do that, and I said, well, I mean, basically, any art I did in Cairo in relation to the Egyptian Revolution had nothing. The point of it was the context and the time and so on. So if I'm in Chelsea, in New York, I don't want to like just package the Egyptian Revolution in a marketable way for some rich white people in Chelsea to buy. I said I'm not going to do that, but I have something to say about America. And so
yeah. So what did you have to say? Because your show had it had Martin Luther King, it had guns, it had the NYPD. Tell us about that show that you had. I think it was 2015 in New York.
Right. Yeah, it was January 2015, and I mean the show was very. I think it was very critical to a large degree You know, it kind of spoofed the NYPD because the NYPD was killing people, black people who sell cigarettes on corners, apparently. So you know that was very present there. The sort of I want to say the gap between this idea of smiling and being happy in America, right? So you walk around, you know, you go to, if you walk down the aisles of a supermarket, all the labels have will have a happy face on it in some way or another, you know, like a Paul Newman tomato sauce or something, right? Or whatever, you know, just like the depiction of happiness is very over the top, right? You see it on the magazine stands, you see it on TV and so on. And then versus like actually the reality, which is like a lot of people doing like really miserable jobs that they don't want to do, but they have to because they need to survive to pay the bills to survive in a place like New York City, right? And they work in Dunkin' Donuts, they work at, you know, Starbucks, and you know, so there was a lot of that. So a lot of, you know, gun violence and that, and a lot of focusing on like aspects of dark aspects of American history and so on and so forth. So, of course, this was in Chelsea, New York, and the show was not really met very well, I would say, by some viewers. I mean, the typical audience of that gallery, right? But interestingly enough, though, like 2 years later with Trump in power, everyone's like, comes up to me and tells me, you know, that show is very much ahead of its time. I'm like, no, it wasn't ahead of its time. You just didn't have, you weren't like looking careful, but I mean, it was all there. It's just like, it's if you could look and see it or not, like where you focus your view, you know. So yeah.
I want to ask you about. There's this great comic website. Maybe some of us have read called The Nib, which publishes comics journalism and editorial cartoons and comic memoir. You've just published a story there called Selected Myopia. That's kind of like your own journey, and it's the first time, as far as I'm aware, you've gotten this personal. Can you give us a kind of snapshot of what it was to go from being a street artist in Cairo to where you are now?
I think the biggest part of it is that there's a sense of being more of a loner. Like I feel like I operate very much alone now. While in Cairo, even if I wasn't necessarily part of, I don't know, a coalition or something, but it's like there was an atmosphere of like artists. We would all, from various backgrounds, whether you're a visual artist or you're you know, a filmmaker or a musician or a journalist or a musician, whatever it is you are, we would all kind of operate in the same circles, I feel, and we would like meet at the same cafes, and we would talk about what we're doing, and we would see each other's work and kind of riff off of it. And there was kind of like an almost very organic sense of community in a way. And it was empowering, and there was kind of strength to that. And of course now it's just, I'm completely disconnected. The reality of being disconnected is, of course, the work is different. It's work that comes out of me sitting at my table for, you know, drawing for 4 weeks without seeing a single living organism for a while.
I really enjoyed.
It's so different.
We were talking last night how you're kind of you pop out of bed in the morning and you have this strict work practice in daylight hours. Ali was telling us how he's this night owl. He can't start working till midnight, and when he's working on a show, he doesn't see the sunlight for 3 months. But
Right.
but I think that's a big part of being in Cairo, which is a city that lends itself to community and late night hanging out, and most things don't open till quite late. I think there is a big transition. I mean, you're based in Philly now. How has that impacted your practice as an artist, coming from Cairo and having been living there for some time?
I mean, what Genzito was saying about, regardless if it's a revolution or not, it's always the context of where you are and when you are and all that. So even if I had plans on like continuing certain ideas or projects artistically that I had in Egypt, I haven't been able to here because it's very different. But at the same time, a big part of what I was interested in with the work was architecture, especially the architecture of Cairo. And where we are in Philly right now, there is a similar kind of sense of decay to a lot of the surrounding architecture. So I'm using that as like a starting ground, just to see the kind of commonalities. And recently that's kind of the direction that I'm heading in with artwork. Before that, I was struggling to kind of find any sense of purpose here, specifically, just because it wasn't a very straightforward move. I'm still moving back and forth constantly between Cairo and Philly, so it makes it difficult to be like, well, where am I right now? And I also don't want to make something about just being lost, because I feel like that'll just make me more lost.
How important is the 2013 moment of Morsi's government being overthrown, of this huge crackdown on dissent, what Human Rights Watch has called a crime against humanity in terms of killing of protesters, and this sort of resurgence of autocracy that's quite familiar to Egypt? How important is that for your work and your last show, The Slow War?
I mean, it's there. It's that whole spirit is basically the show. It's just that I try my best to not look at it as actual events. I want to take the feel of it. I want to take, because what we were talking about the other day, about something where you're doing something specifically about a point or a specific point in time or a specific event, or you're trying to do something that's a bit more, hopefully, timeless, where it can be, it's like, this isn't exclusive to Egypt, just like, it's not exclusive to any country. This is the spirit that we're living in. It's not the revolution. It's like, the revolution failed, but the spirit that informed it is still very much there. It's just trying to, exist in a different way, I guess.
What's the line between being an activist and being an artist?
Yeah. I think intention is a big part of it.
Intention?
Yeah, because there's the expectation of you can have an opinion, you can have a say on something, you can have a strong opinion, put it out there, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are the person for others to turn to when it comes time to do something about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will be there at the time and place leading a specific cause. You just recognize that there is certain issues. And you were saying that about the work that you did when you first got here. You weren't trying to lead any kind of cause or revolution or anything, but you're pointing out what you're seeing.
No, yeah. I'm not an activist. I never called myself one,
But I think when we were talking about this yesterday, you're necessarily involved in politics. You can't escape the politics of the moment. That's kind of just part and parcel of working in 2017.
Sure, but the point is, no one can escape politics. Even when you think you're escaping politics, you aren't escaping politics because, if you do some abstract expressionism thing that may not be obviously about anything in particular, right? It's still, and this happened in the 70s, can be co-opted by the CIA to battle the rise of socialist realism around the world, right? And it's just it becomes part of a political game of battling communism or something, whatever it is, right? There's always, if you do art about nothing, it's easier to co-opt than doing art about something, is the idea.
Tell us, as a curator, how do you see the reception of contemporary Arab art for American audiences? I mean, are people open to it? What are the reactions? Are people surprised to see that there's this rich history of modernity and contemporary art coming from the region? Or what are your impressions?
I don't think anymore. When I started writing about modern and contemporary Arab art in 2006, and I had been, or publishing on it, I should say, and I had been researching it since 2002. And really, in the States, there was no field for it whatsoever. There were a few scholars who were scattered who had just, really been pushing for it and been doing amazing work since the 1980s. But other than that, it wasn't as, it wasn't common knowledge. So I remember when I was looking for grad programs to go into, I graduated with a BA in art history, and I was all gung-ho when I was going to go to grad school. The graduate advisor in the art history department at Berkeley said to me, "Oh, I didn't know those people did that." And I said to her, "Did what exactly?" She said, "Create art. I didn't know that they created contemporary art." And then, click, that was it. That was the end of the conversation. And I turned to my dad, who's an art dealer in California for the last 30 years, and I said to him, "I just have to do it on my own because it's just going to be impossible." And so in the beginning, it's funny because when I moved to New York in 2006, kind of the vogue was, artists who were based here, and there have been Arab artists since the time of Khalil Gibran when he came. And so, Arab American artists have always been here, and they've always been working. And like Samia, for example, she was active in the Midwest in the 60s, and then later on in New York in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So they've been here, but the kind of conception was that, these were artists that Americans were going to save. So there was the show in MoMA in 2006 where it was, the so-called Islamic world, but yet you had artists like Muna Haytoum who come from Christian, secular families. And so a lot of these kind of political overtones were dictating what was shown and how it was being framed and this kind of thing. So artists at that time were kind of combating stereotypes, right? So after 9/11, what an Arab is, what a Muslim is, how the Arab world really is, how it's seen through the lens of American media, this kind of thing. And slowly but surely, we started to make progress. So if you look at the show that happened at the New Museum in 2014, that was an excellent show.
This Here and Elsewhere? Is that?
Yes, Here and Elsewhere. That was an excellent, excellent show. And the reason why it was so great is because the curators of that show framed it in a way, it was a kind of pan-Arab show, looking at art from North Africa and West Asia, and the diaspora. And the way that they did it was it kind of was curated around art scenes. So in one instance, you had like key figures of the Beirut art scene, and it was a range of artists. You had Atal Adnan, who at that point was in her 80s, two younger artists who were just coming out. And so you had Beirut, and then you had Cairo, and then you had all these different kind of circles that were detailed, and it even extended into Iran as well. And that was really fantastic because it seemed like the curators really took the time to try to figure things out. And I know that in the lead up to organizing that show, they faced a lot of backlash and had approached artists who said, absolutely not. Given what happened with MoMA and other shows that followed, I won't be in an all-Arab show. And it was too bad because it was really, really well done. And the curators were kind of on the defensive about that as well. And in the end, it worked out. So there has been a shift significantly.
Thank you. So I think we'll open up to questions now, and love to hear your thoughts. And if you could, for my sake, could you just introduce yourself, please, and keep it to a question, if possible. We'll start with this gentleman.
Hello. Hi. I'm Ben, and this is a question for all the panelists. I'm wondering if you guys can speak on behalf of art and cultural appropriation, the boundaries there. And also, I'm also wondering, as far as you were talking about Syrian art before, we know that certain black markets have opened up and the selling of certain pieces of art have gone around, and I'm wondering if you can speak on behalf of that as well.
So on the first question, I'm going to recuse myself because I've been living in Egypt for the past 2 years, and I've missed this whole reappropriation debate. And I've been trying to read up on it, and I don't get it because I think what artists and writers always do is reappropriate. But I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Maybe you want to start, Ganzir. Do you have any thoughts on cultural reappropriation?
Obviously what we do is reappropriate things, but the reappropriation you're talking about, I think, is a different kind. Like with Marvel Comics, it makes everyone black, or riffs off of all their superheroes black, or riffs off of some hip-hop covers, and tells their artists to do homages to hip-hop covers for I don't know, Wolverine and Captain America. Well, that doesn't make any sense. The appropriation doesn't make, there's no concept behind it. The only motive is to tap into a certain market that they feel is untapped and they could sell these comics to. And by thus expanding their market from their current predominantly white market and expanding into other territories. And so when the motive is completely commercial, right? And that that goes for music, popular music, not actual an artistic expression of musical using music for artists for personal expression or something, but like, just pop music basically essentially to sell something. Then it's the motive that counts, right? I think that's how I see it.
Do you want to add something on that score?
I mean, I agree with that, but at the same time, it's about the purpose at the end of the day. And if there's a subversive element in like what you're doing, then it can definitely work for you. But that's essentially it.
Can you tell us about Syrian black market for antiquities? Is that something that you've come across? I guess inevitably it's a big question with UNESCO and et cetera, but.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And a lot of them end up in Israel. So that's interesting in the sense of how the war plays out and how, things are run from one country to the next. And I don't say that in any kind of way. I mean, before that it was, looted items would end up in Beirut. There was a big case with the Getty where there were some Greek vases that that Greece wanted back and they were fighting over. This was years ago. And it turned out that the Getty's curator had bought them from a dealer in Beirut. Well, how did they end up in Beirut? So there are all these kind of different channels. And definitely with the American occupation of Iraq, I mean, looting wasn't just reserved to ancient artifacts. It was a whole museum of modern art, a lot of which ended up in Jordan. And they're Jordanian galleries that were selling the works. And there was an American task force that then was put in place with art historians who were familiar with the work and had researched it and knew the work and gone to the museum and seen them when they were hanging there before the invasion. And they tried to track them down. And there were also efforts from Baghdad itself where a team of people were trying to locate them. This happens all the time. And unfortunately, unlike Iraq, I don't know if Syria has that task force now in terms of trying to track them down. I don't think that there's even the mental space to even be working on something like that right now, unfortunately.
Let's talk to Matt. Yeah.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Matt. I'm curious about something you said, Jonathan, early when you first began this discussion this morning about the role of art and culture just in broader policy discussions. For me, that's music to my ears. I've lived in DC off and on for 8-9 years, and I've been to so many talks where art, culture is not a part of the discussion when it comes to policy, when it comes to international relations. I guess this is more of a question for you, but please, everyone, please weigh in. Why and how do you begin to infuse these discussions with this really vital source of humanity?
Well, maybe selfishly, I have a lot of fun doing this. I've interviewed a lot of, public officials, civil servants, all of these kind of folks, and you get certain kind of information, but people are very cautious. But if you go sit down with a novelist like Sonala Ibrahim, or I met with the Syrian poet Adonis, who's quite controversial and has his own set of issues that we could talk about, but you get a sharp perspective. You get a different way of seeing the world. If you go sit with the former Minister of Finance in any given country, okay, maybe you'll get some of the sharpest insights on finance, but what I love about meeting with novelists, filmmakers, writers, you get people don't feel limited in just their small profession. It's not like a comic artist is just gonna talk about comics. They're gonna talk about their observations about the whole world. And for me, that fluidity is key. And while, I lived in Washington previously, so I'm well attuned to how Capitol Hill briefings and white papers and think tank events go. And I do think there is a value to them, but I wanted to have a conversation today that isn't about what country we should intervene in, but I want to have artists have an intervention in Washington and to consider how we can bring in new perspectives into this forum.
Why is that not more? I totally agree. Why is that not sort of?
In this city, well, I don't know. Look, policymakers, and maybe I'm going out on a limb here, policymakers are comfortable hearing perspectives they're comfortable with. And those often come from former policymakers or former researchers. And there's something about the discomfort of the arts. Look at Ali's work that's up on the screen. Look at documentations of massacres in Palestine. look at a narrative about climate change in the not too distant future, these are challenges to the basic preconceptions that any given capital, whether it's Geneva or London or Paris or Washington, might have. So I hope that we've pushed the ball a little forward, but I don't have any kind of I don't have a huge hope, because that's not what this city is about, I suppose.
You have to forgive me, it's going to be a struggle to... I want to go back to question of...
Let's grab the mic, though. I want to make sure everyone can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I want to go back to the question of reappropriation. And I want to get your feel of what's happening, or what the role Arab artists are playing in the sort of rapport between the West and the Muslim or the Arab world. And you see all sorts of things. I mean, both of you mentioned that your patrons wanted you to do certain kinds of work, very specific kind of work. You've had books like Reading Lolita in Tehran, I don't know if you're familiar with that, which was sort of very popular here, but on the same time, it was sort of feeling a mandate to say bad things about Iran and allow people to criticize Iran. Other authors, Dutch Somali woman, also has been used in the same way. It's very popular, but sort of, because she's very critical of Islam, but which is really her own personal experience, but he used in a broader context. When a Western musician uses Arabic scale in a song or in a melody, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing?
Are you talking about Jay-Z?
No, I was thinking more about sort of the French musical scene, actually, I'm more familiar with. You've had, like, I don't know if you know L'Arabe du Futur, which was a sort of comic strip that was very popular in France, or some novels, musicians as well. Is that sort of bringing this syncretism in a positive sense, or is that appropriation, or is that stereotypification of the Arabs, or further stereotypification of the Arabs? I think it's all three at the same time, but which one is sort of dominating? Do you think things are getting better, or actually it's just really going back to the stereotypes, the nasty stereotypes of the Orient?
Want to start? I imagine it's going back to the stereotypes, because, but it also it has to do with what's an easy sell. If I was to declare, or just like put a post online that I'm working on a book that is critical of my Islamic surroundings during my upbringing, I will have 20 publishers approach me.
And 20 million followers.
Right? Half of them will be French, a few will be American, and maybe the rest will be German. You know what I mean? And so there are certain markets that are attracted to certain subject matters. And of course, a book like The Arab of the Future is an incredibly easy sell. And that is what publishers are interested in, from graphic narratives from the Middle East. If you're a Middle Eastern comic book artist and you do an autobiographical work that is critical of your upbringing and where you came from and all these Islamic tradition stuff, it's like so easy to sell, and you get paid for it. You get a nice advance, and you work on your book. No, if I was to do something that's critical of the West, there's just no way that will get funded unless I'm already very, very, very popular. So of course it has to do with I don't want to say certain agendas, but it has to do with what is perceived by these publishers as what is an attractive book that will sell very easily in that marketplace. And I mean, it's true, they do sell easily and quite well. There's another author in Germany, Hamid Abdelsamad, who's very well known for writing these very critical books of Islam and so on. And I mean, also too, for example, an interesting example of the Arab of the Future is that he often in his interviews says, I do not consider myself an Arab, I'm French. But he wrote a book called The Arab of the Future about himself. So you can't have it both ways.
Well, I'm a fan of The Arab of the Future, but we can talk about that after. Maimuna, do you want to add to this conversation about representation, etc.?
I mean, the question, came up about appropriation. I automatically think ISIS, because for me, at least, the visuals of ISIS, everything from the dress to the aesthetic of the videos and everything, it's taken from Hollywood movies. And these stereotypical kind of portrayals of what the Arab terrorist is. I mean, it's exactly formulaic about, So when I think appropriation, I automatically think that. So.
That's fascinating.
I mean, for me, it was more journalism, what you were talking about right now. There was like an expectation for what you were writing and how it fit in, and how, like, are you going to be critical of this in this way? Are you going to be... And sometimes the people who were looking at my artwork familiar with journalism would want to see that. It's like, well, you wrote pieces like criticizing this and this and this, but like, you know, I'm not seeing that strong of an opinion in the artwork. And it's like, there's no actual responsibility to be doing that. And what you got out of the piece that was written maybe wasn't what you were supposed to get out of it, or maybe wasn't like the full, you know. So I've dealt with it in journalism, I feel, a lot more than with the art so far, luckily, yes.
Do we have any?
There's pressure that's put on artists, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, right now in Germany, there's just one show after another for Syrian artists. And not to be crass, but if it wasn't for the situation in Syria, you wonder if they would be getting these shows.
Yeah.
Because it literally every single month in different parts of Germany. And it's fantastic. It's great because, I mean, I'm happy as a historian because I see these artists have been working very, very hard for a very long time, and you know, they're getting the public exposure, but at the same time, they themselves are skeptical because there is this pressure to quote unquote perform, right? I mean, in terms of, you know, you have to have all the buzzwords and refugee crisis and the war and, you know, civil discord and all these sort of things. A lot of expectations to be outright and ardently anti-Assad, you know, where some artists want to remain neutral because they're nervous about the future and they want to go back to Syria and they're not sure how this whole thing is going to work out. So I think right now, at least for the Arab world, there is a lot of pressure. And maybe if we just all stopped giving into it, maybe if we all made a pact and said, you know, we're not going to do it. Because I know, for example, in Egypt in the 90s, there were a group of women artists that weren't necessarily associated, but they happened to be female and they were working in Cairo. And eventually, they just stopped hosting American and European curators because they got sick of it. Because they came with an agenda. They wanted to see certain types of work. They wanted these buzzwords. They wanted, you know, X, Y, and Z. And they were like, but we also have male colleagues, and we also don't necessarily discuss specifically feminist issues. We're looking at all kinds of things, and our work is, you know, not to be pigeonholed. So they just stopped. They just, no more. You're not invited to my studio, and that's it. So that was interesting in terms of a pact that they kind of made, an informal pact.
That's, like, whenever I'm here and I'm talking to people about being an Egyptian artist, there is very much that, like, oh, well, what have you done about the revolution, or what about the past few years, or the past few years must have been really
You don't
inspiring.
work with hieroglyphics either?
When I fly home, taking my art with me, and I get stopped by customs people at the airport in Egypt, and they're like, what do you have in your portfolio? And I'm like, just some artwork. They pull out and look at it, it's like, why don't you draw the Nile?
But these are Egyptian,
Egyptian
custom officials.
Yeah. So the Egyptian custom officials are very much like, you know, why don't you have a nice painting of the pyramids? What's wrong with the Nile? Why is everyone dead? You know, and so yeah, it depends very much. Like the sense of expectation is, you know, it's hard to deal with sometimes.
Do we have time for one more question? We'll take this gentleman over here.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Amr Al-Hita. I kind of wanted to follow up on kind of exactly that. And since we've talked a lot today about Western ideas about representations of the Middle East, and I kind of wanted to see what your thoughts were about Middle Eastern representations about the Middle East and about themselves. I guess, you know, Ali, you were kind of getting to touch a little bit about that, you know.
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and sometimes I like to even flip it more. What are Middle East representations of the West? But maybe you can tell us, you know, how is your work received in Egypt, or what do people think about your work today in Egypt?
I remember my very, no, it's not my first exhibition, but I remember an early exhibition, an exhibition I had in 20, I want to say 10 possibly, at the Palace of the Arts in Cairo. So
which is like the Ministry of Culture,
very official,
stodgy,
governmental, big gallery palace place for showing. And it was a very big show with lots of artists, some of them young, some of them old. And Mohammed Abla and Hani Rashid both came up to the exhibition. This was before it actually officially opened, and they, you know.
These are one of the more senior painters in Egypt, and kind of one of his students, who Hani Rashid has become, in and of his own self, a really prominent artist.
Very prominent. Yeah. At the time, he might have been a little less, but like, of course, now he's like super prominent. And Mohammed Abla is very, very prominent, and has always, for a very long time, has been prominent. And basically, so they came up to my part of the exhibition, and they like stared at it for a long time, and they really admired it. He said nice things. But then Abla, came up to me, he's like, but you know, your work is too clean. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, Egypt is a dirty place. You need to dirty up your art a little bit, you know? And I mean, you know, fair enough. I mean, so I guess what I'm trying to say is there's always an expectancy of what is Egyptian and what isn't Egyptian. And I feel like, kind of almost like myself, like my personality, I've sort of almost always operated between realms in a way where, like, if I'm in Egypt and I don't know, just wearing shorts in a cab, and a cab driver was like, hey, so
where are you from?
Are you off to play a game? I'm like, no, I'm not playing, I'm just wearing shorts. It's a hot day, you know? Although I might get that in DC here because everyone's wearing suits, right? And then of course the other way around, when I'm in the States, I'm very much that Egyptian guy, right? So it's
a sense of not belonging in a way.
Not belonging or belonging in both ways. It's sort of this weird in-between realm that I'm sure other couple people here probably share as well.
Do either of you have anything to add on that?
I know that answered your question.
No, I just feel like that's Abla's thing because he did the same thing with me when I visited his studio.
He said your work is too clean?
He didn't even say, he just took I took my portfolio and he just started drawing all over everything. And then explained to me that my work was too clean.
I think we have time for one more question if someone can grab a mic or anyone else, or we call it let's call it a day. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank ICWA for I want to thank especially Edward Joseph and Dirk Van de Waal and the whole ICWA team for bringing us together and bringing our really excellent esteemed panelists. And if you're interested in learning more about the fellowship, this 2-year immersion, I'd really be thrilled to talk to you about it. So thank you all for coming. And yeah, visit our website, ICWA.org. And again, thanks for participating in today's symposium.